Mortal Kombat, everyone's favorite violent video game. So popular it spawned 3 separate movies and 18 different video games over the past 30 years. Which makes me wonder, how did a single video game become such a cultural icon, influencing American politics and igniting a new generation of psychological studies? Mortal Kombat was originally developed by Midway Games in 1992 by Ed Boon and John Tobias, based on an idea they had of making a video game starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, a Belgian martial artist and movie star known for appearing in Bloodsport and Universal Soldier, as well as for his epic splits. However, once they figured out they were unable to afford Van Damme for the game, they decided to make a martial arts fighting game with the intent to rival the most popular fighting game at the time, Street Fighter II. In an effort to differentiate themselves from Street Fighter, they used more realistic graphics, gritty violence, hidden features, and a revolutionary set of violent moves called Fatalities, a concept which still exists in the current games. There was a massive marketing campaign to bring the game to existing gaming systems that was extremely successful, marking September 13, 1993 as Mortal Monday. The release was considered unprecedented in the US game industry and was one of the largest releases of a video game at the time. Although the game had a clean version without blood being released to home gaming systems, the fully violent version was released to the arcades, which were more popular and accessible to young audiences at the time. As it happened with previous video games, Mortal Kombat birthed an immediate moral panic over what children were being exposed to. The violence within the games was considered unlike anything that had been released before, and the fact that these games were marketed specifically towards children raised concerns over the potential that they would cause on violence and crime. The media firestorm around Mortal Kombat prompted calls for the video game industry to self-regulate, and when they failed to do so quick enough, lawmakers stepped in and called a congressional hearing to discuss the damage of video games among the youth. On December 9, 1993, less than 2 months after Mortal Kombat's release, the US Congress had a formal hearing regarding the state of violence in video games available to the public. Their intent was to inform families of the content of video games to better protect children. Over the course of the hearing, Democratic Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut spoke about video games, stating these games teach a child to inflict torture. Toy guns were brandished, and different gameplay clips were shown, with an emphasis on the most violent Mortal Kombat fatalities. I'll only be showing the least violent of the two because my mom is watching, but the second, involving head removal, along with the current playlist of Mortal Kombat 2019 fatalities, which are realistically graphic, are down below. Senator Lieberman also highlighted the issue of violence against women within video games, an issue that is still discussed today both inside and outside of the video game industry. The result of the hearing was the implementation of the Esrb Ratings, a system where games are rated ranging from early childhood for children in a preschool audience all the way to adults only 18+, focusing on graphic themes such as sexualized content, extreme portrayals of violence, or unsimulated gambling with real currency. This was imagined as an absolute classification, with it being a quick and easy way of solving what children were allowed to access, protecting them from adult situations. However, the reality of the situation is that even today, after nearly 50 years of video games existing in popular culture, there is still discussion into the exact effects that violence within video games have on an individual. There have been hundreds of studies, however many of them were plagued with fatal flaws in how they were oriented. Early researchers often did not know how to properly create environmental controls within video game studies, and had strong biases which affected the conclusions of those studies. This was in no small part due to the fact that most academic researchers at the time were largely unfamiliar with video gaming, as video games were marketed almost exclusively towards young children until the late 1990s. Because of this, control groups were difficult to set up during testing, and researchers often measured irrelevant data and focused on the results of earlier studies on aggression, such as Bandura's Bobo doll study, or the effect of television on children. Further, the results of studies on the effects video games had on aggression varied wildly, with some studies showing a strong connection between violence and video games, others showing no connection, and some showing that violent video games reduced violent tendencies. When coupled with meta-analyses showing studies that connect violence with video games are much more likely to be published and thus receive media attention, it can be difficult to make any solid conclusion on if video games cause violence in children, if children prone to aggression seek out violent media, or if aggression instead manifests in children due to social influences and personality traits. Nevertheless, as technology progressed into the new millennia, the 6th generation of game consoles were released. further popularizing video games in the home. Together, the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox, released in 2000 and 2001 respectively, resulted in the decline and replacement of arcade gaming, with almost 170 million gaming consoles being sold worldwide by 2010. In the US, the argument on game censorship finally came to a head in 2011, with the US Supreme Court case Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association. In short, the case overturned a California law that banned the sale of violent video games to children without parent consent. The previous California law was passed in 2005 with the support of then-Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and required clear labeling beyond the existing Esrb Ratings system in addition to controlling the sale of video games to minors. Interestingly enough, Schwarzenegger's likeness was used with his permission in the latest Mortal Kombat game as an unlockable character. The law would have a maximum $1,000 fine for each infraction, and the definition of violent video game used a variation of the Miller test, a three-prong obscenity test created by the Supreme Court for determining whether speech or expression can be labeled as obscene. As such, violent video games would have to meet the following three criteria. First, whether the average person, applying contemporary community standards, would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest, meaning arousing or appealing to the sexual desire. Second, whether the work depicts or described, in a patently offensive way, sexual conduct or excretory functions as defined by state law. Patently offensive means referring to obscene acts or materials that are considered to be openly, plainly, or clearly visible as offensive to the viewing public. And third, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. The law was first overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that the definition of a violent video game was considered too broad and was based on the state's subjective opinion, and that the state of California must prove that the recited harms are real, not merely conjectural, and that the regulation will in fact alleviate these harms in a direct and material way. The state, however, was not able to do so, as many of the studies and experiments presented in the court had notable flaws within them. In 2009, shortly after the California court declared this law unconstitutional, Governor Schwarzenegger appealed the law to the U.S. Supreme Court. In a 7-2 decision, the court ruled in favor of the previous decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, with even the two dissenting judges arguing that this instead was an issue of precedence or of how children should be educated, rather than that of free speech and the censorship of video games. However, the true success of the ruling was that video games became a protected art form under the First Amendment. This gave an additional sense of legitimacy to video games, and no doubt helped to encourage academic study and professional attempts to archive video games for future study and preservation. The Library of Congress has a collection of several thousand video games and curates a list of some of the most important and influential games produced over the several past decades, both due to the larger cultural ripples they have caused and the importance to the respective genres. The library makes every attempt to include physical details, such as the box art, manuals, and physical copies if they are available. Outside of government agencies, some museums have been created to remember and celebrate video games. Some of those are sponsored by companies such as Nintendo or Microsoft, who focus on company-specific games, whereas others are created and curated by private individuals. Some of the more notable examples are the Video Game Heritage Society, the Center for Computing History located in the UK, the National Video Game Museum in Texas, and the Game Preservation Society in Tokyo, an organization whose goal is to preserve as many Japanese video games as possible, and has nearly 80% of all Japanese-produced video games in their library. But with the rise of the internet, more games have limited or no physical releases, being produced, advertised, and distributed completely online with no special hardware or materials being introduced. While this is becoming more and more common within the AAA video game industry, between 1996 and 2020, hundreds of thousands of games were published independently online using Adobe Flash. Many of these games were poorly built or contained incredibly offensive material in an attempt to gain popularity. However, many more were able to be built as works of entertainment and art, with many serious Flash developers moving on to professional game development. These developers began in small teams or as individuals who received little recognition or payment outside of online communities where these games were made available, such as Newgrounds, Armor Games, or Congregate. However, it is with a heavy heart that I've learned that as of December 31st, 2020, Adobe Flash software was sunsetted and is no longer being supported. Millions of hours of hard work and dedication will completely be lost over the next few years as internet browsers will no longer support the software while it ages and becomes incompatible with future updates. Flash games comprise almost 25 years of creation from independent developers, and their unconventional introduction, combined with their lack of physical media, means they are one of the least documented and least preserved kinds of video games there are. I would like to read a quote by Brad Bourne, the creator of one of the most memorable Flash series that have managed to move onto a mobile game platform, the Fancy Pants adventure games. Flash games at their best had such a raw, personal connection to their creators. When playing them, you could feel the artist's hand and the passion they poured into their work. Flash games and animations felt accessible. The effect was immediate and intoxicating. I was able to build something that I felt was distinctly mine, while working around and also embracing my own strengths and weaknesses. The insane reach, the community, the crazy creatives. Nothing else comes close, and most people just have no clue how absolutely massive Flash was. It's still almost impossible for me to wrap my head around the fact that I was able to create something that had an impact in the world, and Flash made that possible. Thankfully, there has been a project over the past couple of years which has been dedicated to creating an online library of Flash games that anyone can download onto their computer. The Blue Maxima Flashpoint project consists of more than 100 contributors who have been able to collect more than 70,000 of these games and over 8,000 Flash animations. It's a time capsule of the 2000s when the internet became mainstream and expression began to move online. It's a reminder of the work that millions performed in an effort to create something personal to them they could share with the world. If you'd like to experience a living piece of the past, you can play the Fancy Pants adventure games, as I've included an online link down below. I've also included a link to download the Blue Maxima Flashpoint. However, it's still important to please remember that this is first and foremost an unfiltered archive of Flash games and animations of the early internet. For every work of art, there are 50 or even 100 other creations that lack any artistic value or are intentionally offensive at an extreme level. If you'd like to download the Flashpoint project and play Flash games, you can find the link down below, along with other links suggesting hundreds of the best available options. But please remember to review anything before letting minors play. However, that is just one of the directions that video games had moved into over the past several decades, and it asks several questions. What constitutes art in a video game? What is the best way to share a gaming experience? Should there be a national video game registry, just the same as there is a national movie registry? And finally, should video games be regulated in a unique way that other media forms are not? Let me know your thoughts down below, because I don't think there is a solid answer. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'm the Pop Historian.